Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
And I'm Max Blumenthal, journalist and author of Republican Gomorrah.
And you and I first started interacting on Twitter after I'd written a couple of pieces about the upcoming election and how I'm not voting for President Obama because I'm disappointed in his civil liberties and executive power policies over the last 4 years, and those are kind of deal breakers for me. And I'm not a Mitt Romney fan particularly either. I read another piece actually why I refused to vote for Mitt Romney, and I'm going to support a third-party candidate this year, Gary Johnson, who is the Libertarian candidate and who is basically in agreement with me on all of the civil liberties and executive power, kind of war on terror, war on drug stuff, that are some of the most important issues to me, and that I feel like have gotten short shrift since a Democrat was in the White House. And why don't we just talked on Twitter, so why don't you kind of lay out your objection to what it is that you've seen that I've written and that you disagreed with?
Well, first of all, thanks for having this conversation. I think it's kind of a disgrace that the third-party candidates haven't been given any exposure in the mainstream press, not just in the debates, but in general. None of them have been profiled. And I was at the third-party debate in Chicago, and I thought, this is democracy in action. These candidates are bringing out ideas that aren't being discussed in the major presidential debates. But I was listening to Gary Johnson talk because he was basically forced to discuss domestic issues, and I thought, his positions on domestic issues are basically Tea Party or to the right of the Tea Party. Meanwhile, the energy from his campaign is really coming from his positions on foreign policy, his positions on the drug war, basically his progressive positions, or what seem to be progressive positions, those he espouses. And I thought of your piece in which, for The Atlantic, which I thought was an important piece, where you took on Obama on his secret drone war, on the drug war, on assassinating 2 American citizens, on drawing up special legal memos to do that. I mean, appalling abuses of executive power, which really built on Bush's abuses of executive power, his massive expansion of executive power through the unitary executive theory. And I thought, you had said that you wouldn't vote for Obama and you were voting for Gary Johnson because you had set these moral red lines. But you didn't engage or critique Gary Johnson's domestic policies, which I find to be extremely radical and much more similar to Paul Ryan's than to Barack Obama's. So the question was, why would you have supported Obama anyway if you support these positions of Gary Johnson on domestic issues, like, for example, ending the income tax, having a fair tax, I don't think he opposes Citizens United or judicial nullification, kind of pet issues of the radical right, in my opinion. So I just wanted to know what you thought of these positions of Gary Johnson on domestic issues, what your critique is of them, and I guess we could just start there.
Yeah. Okay, well, so to start out, I guess I would say that I don't see Paul Ryan's domestic agenda and Gary Johnson's domestic agenda being all that similar. And I think it's tricky when you get into talking about the Tea Party. The Tea Party kind of holds itself out as a libertarian movement in its rhetoric. But in its voting behavior and in the people that it supports, it's really just conservative Republicans, as best I can tell. It's conservative Republicans who, granted, grew disenchanted with the record of the Bush administration in the second term. Actually grew disenchanted more after he left office than when he was still in office. But they're much more likely to support, I guess, what I would call socially conservative and sort of big business corporatist candidates, right? And to me, there's a big distinction between I guess, libertarian domestic policy and Republican Party domestic policy. So I just want to make that distinction up front.
What is the distinction? I mean, when it comes to ending the income tax, that would seem to be a fantasy of the Republican Party and of Paul Ryan. I mean, this is, Milton Friedmanomics, but they realize that it's not really workable. It's a non-starter. So they get as close as they can. And it's the Republicans who are endorsing the fair tax. I mean, Mike Huckabee, that was his big vehicle. And, this, by the way, was an idea that came out of the Church of Scientology, but has found mainstream appeal through the Republican Party. So I see similarities there.
Oh, there are definitely similarities. I mean, they're both kind of broadly speaking, I guess, right-leaning domestic agendas. I don't know. But I would describe Gary Johnson's domestic policy as kind of doctrinaire libertarian and not very detailed and not particularly well thought out. And to kind of answer your question about why I haven't delved into it a bunch, we can talk about, I agree with parts of his domestic agenda and disagree with parts of it. I guess the reason I didn't get into it in my article about Obama or get into Obama's domestic agenda very much is because this election is really about foreign policy and civil liberties for me. And most presidential elections are about that because we've taken this turn, especially since the Bush administration, where the executive has such untrammeled power in this area. You have Obama and Romney both claiming the power to wage war without going through Congress, and you have this whole killing list mechanism that is run through the executive branch alone and doesn't really have a judicial check on it. Indefinite detention, and you go down the line, and the president is just assuming these extraordinary powers, both in the war on terror and to a lesser but still pretty extreme extent in the war on drugs. And my kind of working presumption is that whoever gets into power next is going to be very constrained in what they do domestically, in the same way that Obama has been very constrained. He's faced the filibuster, he's faced this Republican Congress that has basically not let him do a lot of what he wanted to do and kind of was very intransigent and successfully refused to compromise, right? And I think that has prevented the country from solving some important problems. But I also think that it is a check on anyone coming in and enacting a kind of sweeping domestic agenda. And Gary Johnson's domestic agenda, and again, we'll get into talking about its specifics in a minute. I don't think that there is a chance in the world that any of it could pass. I mean, for example, scrapping the income tax system and getting a fair tax. Right now there isn't even agreement in Congress about little minor tweaks to the tax code that seem like they should be common sense and that anyone can agree with. The idea that Gary Johnson would come in and be able to scrap the whole system and implement something else, doesn't make much sense to me. So I guess in my writing, I've focused on these issues because, first of all, Gary Johnson isn't going to win. He's a protest vote, and for me, he's a protest vote against these specific national security and civil liberties failures of Obama and of Romney as well. And even if he did improbably win, which of course isn't going to happen, I don't think that he would be able to push these through. And I think when you're thinking about a candidate you support, what they're likely to do in office, what they're likely to accomplish is probably a more important metric than, if they were a dictator for a day, what range of policies would they implement?
Well, I think it's also unlikely then that he'd be able to enact a civil liberties agenda if you consider the forces he has to grapple with if he were in the executive office. But I don't really think it's very useful or productive to get into hypothetical subjectives, because especially considering that you made your case based on moral imperatives and moral red lines. And so that's what the discussion has to be about. And you're urging people to vote their conscience. And first of all, it's a...
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm... It isn't quite right that I'm just saying there are these moral red lines and vote your conscience. My case is a little bit more pragmatic than that in this way. I think that in the long run, people who care about civil liberties, or for example, or Republicans who care about cutting the deficit, or any constituency within a party, right? you face this long-term, short-term problem, where if you vote third party, the people you agree with on a lot of other things maybe lose an election, right? I think in the medium to long term, if civil liberties voters don't make it clear that they will defect if their issues don't get heard, their issues will never get heard. I think it's important to stand up and say there is a cost to enacting these policies that we don't like, and so I want to raise.
But there are other civil liberties
people
candidates like Jill Stein and Rocky Anderson who support very progressive policies on the domestic front, whereas Gary Johnson basically echoes Newt Gingrich on allowing child labor and uses the same kind of rhetoric. And so I think we have to have moral red flags on domestic issues too, and not just focus on civil liberties. We have to look at the big picture, and that's part of my problem with Obama is when you look at the big picture.
Right. So on something like, well, I guess I should say first that if you talk about the fair tax, right, and whether the fair tax is a good idea or not, and I'm not actually persuaded that it is a good idea, although I haven't delved very deeply into it. Or if you look at, I don't quite know if I would describe what Gary Johnson thinks about labor law as wanting to make child labor legal. But in any case,
I mean, I can quote him on
I think there's a distinction between. I think there's a distinction between a law that you don't think is a particularly good idea, like you don't think that the fair tax is a good idea, right? And I think a lot of Gary Johnson's assumptions about how much growth the fair tax would generate, for example, are mistaken and wrong, right? I think he's empirically wrong about that. I think comparing something like that to, extrajudicially killing people with an assassination list, I don't think that you can compare those morally and see them as being on the same point.
I think you can have a moral judgment on basically eliminating the income tax, which is a wet dream for the 0.1%, and implementing some kind of untested policy that was drawn up originally by the Church of Scientology and which has been adopted by oligarchs and really pushed, as far as I know, by people like the Koch brothers, which would do enormous damage to millions of working Americans. I mean, I think you can make a moral judgment on that. Whether you personally equate that with a kill list is up to you. That's a subjective opinion, but
well, I think you're conflating a few things, right? First is the question of, does the candidate himself think that this policy is going to be the best policy for the people who are going to live under it, right? Or is he intentionally trying to redistribute money to the 1% or something? If I thought that Gary Johnson was trying to just sort of steal the money of the people and redistribute it to the 1%, I would certainly think that was a moral red line that would make me very reticent to ever lend someone like that.
I mean, in an operational sense, in practice, that's what he would do by pushing for something like the fair tax. I mean, every study of it shows that wealth would graduate massively upwards, and it would starve, as Grover Norquist said, what he would want to do is starve the beast, starve the federal government, therefore starving cities, inner cities of revenue, forcing massive cuts on the backs of working people. That's the kind of libertarian Republican agenda, and that's what this kind of policy would do in practice. So, whether Gary Johnson wants to hurt people or not is a different story.
I contest that that's the libertarian agenda.
The economic.
I would say that broadly speaking, the libertarian economic agenda would make a couple of critiques of the current system, right? And different libertarians aren't entirely in agreement about all of this. But one thing that libertarians would say is that the current income tax system itself is skewed in a way that benefits very rich people who have basically gamed the system, and that it permits a ton of rent seeking that is both economically inefficient and that is unfair. And the part of the libertarian critique that always draws the headlines is when they say it sometimes is unfair in taking money that people have earned and redistributing it to other people, right? The part of the libertarian critique that is never really spoken about outside of libertarianism, that they're never given credit for, is also making the critique that some of the rent seeking is by rich people, some of the rent seeking is by corporations. And so when you talk about the reforms that libertarians want to make, they would be getting rid of those things, those upward redistributions, that unfair rent seeking by powerful actors. They'd be getting rid of those things too. You can talk about any particular libertarian idea and whether it would actually do that or whether it would have a perverse effect, and that's a different empirical question. But on the moral question, I don't think it's unfair. I don't think it's fair to say that libertarians are trying to, benefit the 1% and destroy the poor, et cetera.
I mean, it, I guess, is just coincidence that much of the movement is funded and programmed by the 1%, but I would leave that aside and just look at the substance. I mean, Gary Johnson favors idea that was sort of inspired by Thomas Woods, who's a neo-Confederate historian and scholar who was a member of a white supremacist group called the League of the South. Judicial nullification, which has been popular in far-right circles, I think, since the 70s, and it would allow states to nullify federal laws and empower local bullies. And I mean, if you boil everything down to the states, you go down to the states. I mean, states' rights was the platform of George Wallace and various neo-Confederate candidates. You empower local bullies in places like Alabama, where there's a 25% child poverty rate. Those kind of statistics would go up. I mean, you look at what the Tea Party has tried to do in the former Confederate states, and it's to get out of every government program, empower the Southern oligarchs who are running those states, and throw working people who are in the South, disproportionately minorities, into poverty and therefore into prison, which doesn't seem like a very good civil libertarian position. But I want to shift back. I mean, you can
wait, hold on. Let me respond to that real quick.
I mean, okay.
The problematic policies you describe exist under the current federal system in the South. Now, I agree that the libertarians who didn't want the federal government to enforce or pass civil rights laws when half of the when the black population in the South was being subjugated by local government and subjugated elsewhere, not just in the South. I agree that it was a federal imperative to come in and remedy that, and that a lot of libertarians and libertarian-leaning Republicans like Barry Goldwater got that wrong. There's pretty substantial agreement within certain circles of libertarianism that they did get that wrong. If you read Reason Magazine, if you read Cato, there's pretty wide agreement that was a libertarian mistake. On the other hand, when I think about the balance between state and federal power now, it isn't at all clear to me that progressives wouldn't actually benefit from more power being held by the states. In other words, if you could have a deal where the Bill of Rights was still enforced by the federal government, these are constitutional federal rights that we all have, right? But where the states got to make up their own mind on gay marriage and the states got to make up their own mind on the drug war, it seems to me that you can have pretty substantial moves in the direction of both, in the shared direction of progressivism and libertarianism that could well end up making people's lives
except in much of the country, except in places like Cobb County, which in 1996, where the city council authorized Christian theocracy. The city council was overtaken by Christian Reconstructionists who are evangelical libertarians, and they authorized the implementation of Christian law and only pulled back after the International Olympic Committee threatened to pull the Olympics. I think this is true, out of Atlanta, and came under massive pressure. This would happen. It's no coincidence that people like Thomas Woods, who are white nationalists, support these kind of policies like nullification. And it's to say that it doesn't disproportionately affect minorities and doesn't target them ignores the reality. I mean, in Alabama, the governor of Alabama rejected unemployment insurance. The governor of Alabama rejected federal unemployment insurance in 2008
Right,
because he was under pressure
system.
from the Tea Party. That's money that's going to go to working and poor whites and African Americans, and it was mostly African Americans leading the opposition to that move. I don't think that's a coincidence, and I want to keep this part going, but
what you're describing happened under the status quo, under the current system, not under an alternative system.
Well,
where, if you want to talk about a policy that disproportionately affects minorities, the biggest and most consequential one in America is the war on drugs. Again, there are states that are significantly more, the population of various states are significantly more liberal on the war on drugs than the federal government. You might see as many as 3 states legalize marijuana at the local level. That would be a pretty huge thing if multiple state governments ended the war on drugs and its consequences for poor and working class people, both people who would be arrested in the war on drugs, but also people whose neighborhoods are affected by the violence that prohibition creates. So again, it's perfectly clear to me that in 1960 it would have been a terrible thing had states been significantly more empowered relative to the federal government. Today, it isn't at all clear to me that more people would be worse off if the states.
You live in California. I lived in California. I remember the robocalls. It was Prop 66. There was a proposition on the local ballot to get rid of the 3 strikes law, which had people in prison for stealing pizza slices and golf clubs for life. I mean, people buried alive in California, and the public refused to authorize that proposition, which would have released these minor offenders. In Oklahoma, you have people serving 35 to life for minor offenses as well, and it's basically 10 Commandments law. So I'm all in favor of getting rid of federal sentencing guidelines and getting rid of the Rockefeller laws, which is another racist state law in New York. It was passed at the state level. But we have to be aware that when you get down to the states, something that Gary Johnson's VP candidate, Judge Jim Gray, wants to do, he wants to throw all sentencing back to the states. There are going to be a lot of states which will be more draconian than the federal government, and it will empower local bullies. It's not a progressive solution, and I don't think it's a very good civil libertarian solution. And I don't know how much time we have, but I want to go at some point back to foreign policy and the issue of drones and executive power. I'll leave it up to you when you want to bring it back to that. But I got a chance to interview Gary Johnson and found it really interesting.
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, one thing actually, one thing I also want to mention as we go forward, as I look at Johnson's domestic agenda, like I said, I have agreements and disagreements with it. When I look at his record as governor of New Mexico, when he was there for 8 years, he ran it. He did not run New Mexico as an inflexible ideologue who tried to pass pie in the sky reforms that were radical.
No, I think if he became president, he'd be kind of, he's already tailoring his candidacy to, the Beltway crowd, as far as I can tell, and his candidacy is being substantially run by this veteran Republican consultant, Roger Stone. So I don't think he's as pure of an ideologue as he makes himself out to be. You're right. I think what he's doing and what libertarianism often does in a campaign, in an electoral cycle, is parade as progressive and steal energy from the left and shift it to the right. And that's what it seems like he's doing.
I think what politicians do in in elections is highlight the parts of their agenda that are most popular and are constantly
and conceal those that are frightening.
Stuck between the imperatives of their base and the imperatives of the general electorate. Gary Johnson is I think actually less like the average politician, but certainly still a politician in that sense.
Well, he's marketing himself to people who favor marijuana legalization. He's in Colorado. The Democrats there are pathetic. They're drug warriors, and that's a really good position for him. But how many people who are enthused by Gary Johnson's support for repealing these medieval laws on marijuana prohibition know what his domestic policies are and really understand the implications of it? And that's what I think a problem with candidates like him and Ron Paul has been, is that people don't understand the implications of their domestic policy and on foreign policy. Gary Johnson said that he favored keeping Guantanamo open. He favored U.S. intervention in Uganda. And I interviewed him on aid to Israel, and he told me, that he hung out with Benjamin Netanyahu kind of on one of these Israel lobbying trips, I think, and said, Netanyahu should be allowed to do whatever he wants with a free hand, and the U.S. should just basically get out of his face. And that includes Israel's posture towards Iran. I think he's said that, Israel should be allowed to attack Iran without U.S. assistance, and that the U.S. should do, nothing to stop them. So I don't really see this as morally a very progressive foreign policy that he has. And he also said, he asked me, what would...
Well, look, let's can we, for the sake of this conversation, right, let's stop talking about whether something's progressive and just talk about whether it's...
Well, can I tell you why I keep using the word progressive is because the whole framing of this conversation is your piece on why you weren't going to vote for Obama. Obama is someone who I think falsely sells himself as progressive. And so the question, I just don't understand, why you would propose an alternative candidate who wasn't more progressive than Obama, since there's also a Republican candidate who is conservative or, pretends to be a conservative.
I mean, my notion of what is preferable in a candidate isn't whether he fits, isn't to the extent that he is a good progressive, right, or a good conservative or whatever. I'm interested in someone who has a notion of executive power that is far more constrained than the status quo. I'm interested in someone who understands that the Fifth Amendment still applies, even when you say the word terrorism. I'm interested in someone who favors ending the war on drugs and who isn't going to use secret signing statements.
Well, who would that be? Because you said that Gary Johnson wouldn't be able to get much of his agenda through.
Right. I think that the parts of Gary Johnson's agenda that he would be able to get through are the things that that Obama and Bush before him accomplished through executive order, and that exist entirely within the executive branch and don't require congressional approval. I presume that he would be able to at least be better on those things. I don't think that he could just order Congress to end the war on drugs. I do think that he could tell the DEA to use a scientific system to classify marijuana, which would immediately remove it from the class that it's currently in the most dangerous class of drugs. So I have no illusions that he would be able to go in and fix everything. No president would. The things that most alarm me happen to be areas where the executive can, in fact, go in and have a pretty substantial impact simply by not launching any wars without congressional approval and by undoing some of the terrible executive orders and some of the terrible arguments that the Department of Justice is making, things that don't require congressional approval.
Gary Johnson supported the intervention in Uganda, which was launched without congressional approval, as far as I know. And I don't know how Guantanamo can be supported on a civil libertarian basis, but I think we're losing the...
Guantanamo, I meant to flag that before. It wasn't my understanding that he's in favor of keeping Guantanamo open.
I think in 2011 on Judge Andrew Napolitano's show, he said that, but I'm open to being corrected on it. He may have changed his position since being heavily criticized on that.
I imagine he would get heavily criticized on it, but I can't say with certainty either. So
I just see all these inconsistencies with Gary Johnson and Republicans like Roger Stone behind him. He seems to be, to me, a sort of right-wing Republican with some civil libertarian leanings, where it helps him with voters who aren't really engaged with the two parties. I just think we're losing the context here, which is that...
Wait, hold on.
Well, let me just say, and really quickly, we're kind of losing some context, which is that there are also other third-party candidates who come from the left and who are positioning themselves as left-wing alternatives to Obama on all issues, like Rocky Anderson, who actually uses the phrase economic justice, or Jill Stein, who calls for massive public financing for universities, whereas Gary Johnson, when he was asked at the third-party debate why he thinks college tuition is so high, he blamed the students and said they shouldn't be given guaranteed college loans if they can't afford to go to college, which would basically make college for the rich, like it was back in the Gilded Age. So I think, if you're going to say that, why not vote for Obama? There are progressive alternatives to Obama, and then there's Gary Johnson, who is sort of a Republican, in my opinion, a Republican libertarian to Obama, which would also make him kind of an alternative to Romney. And when I look at, where you're coming from versus where I'm coming from, it seems like you're coming from a conservative position based on your writings in the past. I'm coming from a left-wing position, a very left-wing position, which makes it hard for me to support Obama. And we agree on a lot of things about Obama. But my question, given this context, is why you didn't also say why you're not voting for Romney, since you're coming from a conservative position. Why did it have to be framed specifically around Obama?
I mean, I wrote a separate piece why I refused to vote for Mitt Romney. It wasn't shared nearly as widely on Facebook. I wish I would.
It just shows that I live on Facebook.
I did write that piece, and I've written a bunch of pieces criticizing Romney over the course of the campaign and criticizing other Republican candidates in the primaries before that. I should say I would love it if people vote for Jill Stein as a civil liberties protest. Again, the most important thing to me at this point is sending a message that these issues matter and that there's a cost to Democrats to being terrible on them. And I hope that Republicans start acting differently, and that, a guy like Rand Paul, who has been one of the only guys in the Senate trying to stop unnecessary wars and trying to constrain the executive. He was speaking up when Obama went into Libya without congressional permission, for example. And so, you can disagree. I'm sure you do disagree with a lot of what Rand Paul does, but I would love it if more Republicans said there's going to be a cost for being terrible on civil liberties issues. I think this needs to happen in both parties in order for it to ultimately gain traction. Politicians aren't going to pay attention to it unless there's a cost to these things. So if people cast a protest vote for Jill Stein or for anyone else, if their reason is civil liberties, if they speak up about it, even if they reluctantly vote for Obama, but speak up vocally about civil liberties, that would be an improvement over the status quo, I think. But you're right that we're coming from very different places on domestic issues, and I wouldn't describe where I'm coming from as conservative exactly, although I have some opinions, I suppose, that I share with conservatives. If I had to point to if I had to point someone to one place where they could sort of understand where I'm coming from, I would say I'm coming from a kind of Hayekian position. I would say that I favor a strong safety net, and I think that is completely compatible with what ought to be larger classical liberal or libertarian concerns. And at the same time, I think that a lot of policy making, a lot of ideas that I see, for example, from someone like Jill Stein, it seems to me that if we were to implement her ideas, if we were to implement her ideas, for example, about the scale of green jobs that she wants to create, to me, what would happen is a substantial part of the money that we were spending on those green jobs would be spent inefficiently. It would be captured by powerful interests. It might not happen immediately. It would inevitably happen, though. And so, I guess I look at Jill Stein's policies, and I agree with some of her policies, and I, think that she's a candidate who deserved, to have more attention paid to her. At the same time, I ultimately disagree that the policy she wants to implement would turn out well.
I think Rocky Anderson's the best third-party protest vote based on what I've heard from him, and when you talk about a lot of civil libertarian issues, things that are important to civil libertarians, and a lot of it happens through the courts. And so this comes down to the issue of judicial appointments, an area I think Obama's been horrible on. He hasn't been very good on federal judicial appointments. But when you look at the judges and the judicial candidates, it's the candidates who've been groomed through the Federalist Society, who are going to be more in line with a classical economic libertarian agenda. And at the same time, they seem to be in line with the status quo on issues like material support, which have been used to target the Muslim American community, on issues like habeas corpus. And so, I mean, I think, just looking at the candidate and their positions obscures the larger agenda. Someone like Gary Johnson, who comes out of the Republican Party, I think would be more inclined to appoint judges who are going to reinforce the status quo on issues like the war on terror. And I don't know where the other candidates would come from. And I also don't think that candidates coming out of the Democratic Party or people like Elena Kagan are any better. So there's a much deeper crisis here.
I agree that there's a deeper crisis. It's curious. On those kinds of issues, when it comes to the Supreme Court, I'm certainly very wary of the Republican-appointed justices on the Supreme Court. And although I disagree with the farthest left justices on the Supreme Court on a lot of things, I trust them more on constraining the executive. At the same time, I can certainly think of kinds of people who are sort of, broadly speaking, libertarianish in their beliefs, who I think would be really good on executive power. I'm not talking about anyone, on the Supreme Court. I mean, I don't know if you read like the blog The Volokh Conspiracy, for example.
I used to.
But it seems to me like that universe of people, like a Eugene Volokh-like character, would be really good on the First Amendment, would be really good on the Fifth Amendment, would disagree with someone with your perspective. He'd disagree with you on things like Citizens United, I think. But on civil liberties issues, I think he's a pretty in broad agreement with.
I think that's one person. I think Volokh is a pretty strong supporter of the war on terror, at least as far as I've seen it. He's definitely sympathetic to any Israeli military operation, which troubles me. And its implications for how he would treat Muslim Americans, since there's a clear connection there. If you look at the Holy Land 5 case, where 5 Americans were sentenced to 65 years in prison for giving charity to Gaza, to nonviolent organizations funded by the Red Cross and USAID, which happened to have some on-the-ground connection to Hamas, and under material support laws, they were sentenced to life in prison.
Volokh particularly is a First Amendment.
But we have to look at these, because it's really, when in civil liberty, I can't make this point enough, and it was so frustrating to be at the third party debate and not hear it brought up. In issues of civil liberties, since 9/11, and even before, it's Muslim Americans who've been targeted the most aggressively, and who are basically a test case for repealing all of our liberties. And they're not discussed, and it's not politically popular to discuss it. But none of the third party candidates are speaking up. And when I hear Gary Johnson say, "Oh, I'll let Netanyahu do whatever he wants," I mean that tells me he doesn't really understand what's going on.
Well, I don't know. I think when Gary Johnson says "let Netanyahu do what he wants," it's a reflection of the fact that he's basically a down-the-line non-interventionist.
Except in Uganda.
Sure, there are a lot of countries in the world. I have to look into this Uganda thing, too. When was this?
Last year, I think.
Uganda. I don't even know about the intervention.
He has a lot of inconsistencies that are troubling. He, I think, was on Fox News. This might have been in in April. He supported U.S. troops being sent to track down the Lord's Army, which is, this completely bungled operation, which is really about getting a U.S. foothold in Uganda and in that region in Africa, where there are lots of natural resources.
Right. Well, I don't want to comment only because I know nothing about this, and so so maybe we can set that aside for another day. But I would say generally, I think that principled non-interventionism, and I'm not against every foreign intervention that's ever happened in the world that the United States has been involved in, I should say. But to me, principled non-intervention is the best that the United States is going to do at this moment in time. And if you find a candidate who basically says, I don't want to interfere in the Middle East, you kind of have to deal with the fact that that means that he isn't going to interfere when Israel does things that you don't like, just as he isn't going to interfere by going to war in Iran or by starting with a war like Iraq or by invading Syria.
Well, the context is that, we are Israel's colonial patron. We've pledged $30 billion over the next 10 years to them, in addition to all these weapons systems which funded the defense industry back here through loan guarantees. And so without the direct line to Washington, the settlements and Israeli apartheid comes to an end tomorrow. And that was a question that I couldn't really, and I'll put up a transcript later, I couldn't really get Gary Johnson to specifically discuss on the question of aid, especially at a time when, the U.S., like Ted Poe, for example, the congressman from Texas who's a big Tea Party partisan, said, he's for ending all foreign aid except to Israel. Well, most U.S. foreign aid goes to Israel, and it's a huge question, and I think it's a huge question that a lot of libertarians are uncomfortable to talk about. And Gary Johnson basically threw the question back to me and said, well, what would you do? And I explained to him what I would do and about using tactics to force Israel to implement international law or abide by international law. And he said, well, I don't know anything about that, and I don't understand that. And I think, having a candidate like this who doesn't understand these fundamental issues isn't very reassuring. And I think, it's great that you propose the idea of a protest vote, but I think, you want someone who is also kind of capable of embodying the beliefs of this movement that I see building outside the two-party, what's really increasingly looking like a duopoly, and someone who understands those issues. And this is one of those issues.
I'll tell you what I think that Gary Johnson, probably to his detriment, is extraordinarily frank when he doesn't completely understand something. He'll say, yeah, I don't know about that. I don't understand that. It's I've talked to him, I think 3 different times, and met him in person once, and have gotten the impression every time, as have other people who've profiled him, that he approaches interviews, he approaches running generally in a way that probably guarantees he'll never get elected, but that also is more forthright than other candidates. I just think that there are a lot of politicians who don't know about a particular thing and gloss it over much more smoothly. He doesn't try and gloss it over. I agree that it's important to have someone who you support for president who is capable. When I look at his record of being a governor for 8 years, he seemed perfectly competent, just as competent as any governor. There were no catastrophes, there were no missteps, there was no sign that he was a crazy ideologue. To me, that record, and looking at him in his office, tells you a lot more than what he says in any conversation, right? At least it's enough to satisfy me that he wouldn't be catastrophic in some way that Obama or Romney would be good.
I think he would be
one problem with third-party candidates, right, is that they're generally coming to the table with less experience. They've been tested less by the press because they have gotten less attention, right? So this is kind of a problem with third-party candidates generally. Among third-party candidates, it seems to me like Johnson has more governing experience than you generally find. Even someone like Ron Paul, who ran on the Libertarian ticket once and who's was in Congress for years, never really ran anything bigger than his terrible newsletter.
Yeah. Well, it's different when you're in Congress and you're at the helm of a libertarian movement because you can introduce resolutions all the time. But when you're governor, you have to deal with the legislature, and as you said, the administration didn't collapse because he tried to implement a far-right radical agenda like Evan Meekin did in the state next door in Arizona, or like Jan Brewer is doing right now. But to me, he governed like kind of a typical moderate Republican with some right-wing features, and that's how I think he would be as president. So I don't see why he would even be seen as an alternative to Obama. I think the best alternative to Obama, and let me just say personally that I wouldn't support voting for a third-party candidate in a swing state. I think there are clear differences still between Obama and Romney, and that on social issues, on economic issues, on issues of economic justice, and that Romney has surrounded himself with radical neocons on foreign policy, as bad as Obama's been. That I wouldn't support voting for a third-party candidate in swing states. However, I think it is important to register a protest vote and to say that, we're fed up with the two-party system. And Rocky Anderson, to me, is the best alternative. He actually has done something on the issue of the drug war. He personally secured the release of someone named Corey Stringfellow, who was sentenced to 15 years in prison for a minor marijuana offense. He was kind of set up. And it was through the personal pressure of Rocky Anderson that Stringfellow was pardoned. Rocky Anderson was the mayor of Salt Lake City and was a progressive mayor in one of the most conservative states in the country. And he was the only official that I know of in the country who supported the impeachment of George W. Bush, who backed a resolution for Bush's impeachment, and who also, I think, and this should be checked, supported resolutions against the Patriot Act. And another issue that I think we should just bring up, since we've talked about civil libertarians, is the issue of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and that's something that local officials are able to exempt cities from. Portland just did it, but we don't see that. We don't see that happening in a lot of other areas, and that's troubling to me.
So one thing I guess we should talk about before we're done kind of goes back all the way to when Occupy Wall Street was still in the streets, and I was interested then, and I read some other people who were interested then. I think Larry Lessig wrote a piece about this, where he was basically saying that that if you think about the Tea Party as a protest movement, and you think about Occupy Wall Street as a protest movement, there's some common ground there. There's a lot of disagreements, but there's also some common ground. And I think stepping away from Occupy and the Tea Party, if you think about right-leaning, non-interventionist civil libertarians, and you think about progressive civil libertarians, there's some overlap there too, and there are obviously a lot of disagreements. And maybe you and I reflect, if not, I don't think either of us necessarily embody any movement, but we certainly reflect a strain of those different things. So what would it take for people like you and I, or for right-leaning libertarians and progressives to cooperate enough to get the shared parts of the agenda passed? Is that impossible in our two-party system, or is it possible? And what, from your perspective, would it take?
I draw a lot. I have a lot of issues about working with the Tea Party on even a limited basis, just because of what they represent. I consider them to be a racist movement, an Islamophobic movement, a movement that's in the tone that they've spread throughout the country, completely reprehensible. And I've covered them, and a conspiratorial movement.
Forget about the Tea Party. I have a problem with the Tea Party too.
And I just don't know where they converge with Occupy Wall Street. I think they're, they represent completely opposite ends of the pole on economic issues.
Okay, well, if you want to talk about how they converge with Occupy Wall Street, they converge in that they are both against powerful economic actors taking advantage of the government and rent seeking. They were both against the Wall Street bailouts. That's probably the major point of convergence, and that was one of the major complaints of both movements, right? That they were disgusted by the way that in a time of crisis, so much wealth was funneled without any accountability to firms that actually went a long way toward creating the problem. So I think the convergence is pretty clear. But again, I think maybe it's more useful to have the conversation and talk about progressives and libertarians as opposed to progressives and the Tea Party, because I think the Tea Party are ultimately partisan Republicans.
Yeah, well, I think you and Gary and also Gary Johnson understand that there are issues where there are converging issues, and they really relate to issues of war and peace and civil liberties and the drug war. And if libertarians who come from a conservative perspective and civil libertarians who are progressives, who are left-wing, can work together on those issues, then fine. I just think when you get into the details of what someone like Gary Johnson supports, and where a lot of conservative libertarians would like to see things go, which is more in the direction of states' rights, I think any kind of convergence falls apart there. And I don't represent Occupy Wall Street. I supported the movement, but I think what the movement is really about is what people are protesting in Greece and what people are protesting in Spain, and that's the austerity agenda, which both parties support and which the Tea Party was agitating for. The Tea Party wanted more austerity, more cuts in the social sector.
So I have a question. If there were a movement in the state of California where say that some of the people who have been involved in the Bay Area Occupy stuff got together and tried to agitate for more local control for California because they wanted to be able to push a green agenda, they wanted to be able to push and they wanted to be able to push end the drug war agenda, right? And they kind of rallied around those two things, and we're trying to test court cases and basically to get more state autonomy. Would you oppose? Would you be against them because you'd be worried about what other states would do with the same autonomy?
Well,
if the president,
it's another subjective hypothetical. You could approach that from the right and point to all the radical things that Arizona is doing on immigration, starting with Prop 200.
Right.
And so, of course,
this is one of my frustrations.
I would
here, right?
rally with, any Ron Paul person against the federal government raiding marijuana dispensaries in California, which they did under Bush and which they're doing under Obama. But, I don't want to get into subjective hypotheticals. And when you get down to issues of states' rights, there has to be, we have to look at specific issues that where the federal government is involved, and one of those issues is the war on drugs. I just raised that the war on drugs has to end, but there can't just be you can't just say throw it back to the states and let them pass their own Rockefeller drug laws, which they would generally do in red states. There has to be a
See, I think one of my objections, right, one of my frustrations as someone who has some libertarian leanings when talking to critics of libertarianism is the way that you take policies that you don't like and you generalize them as if the libertarian principle behind them is the cause, right? And I don't think I'm doing that. I don't think I'm doing that back. And to give you an example, you talk about how you talk about a terrible thing that a state like Arizona might do, and you immediately connect it with states' rights, and states' rights is therefore bad, right? Imagine if I were to talk about the federal war on drugs and all of the terrible things it's doing in states all across the country, right? And then I were to make the leap and say, see, all of these people who are for federal power and who want to deny states' rights are terrible. That it's a racist policy. They're complicit in a racist policy, right? I don't think it makes sense to make that leap. And I think that a lot of critics of libertarianism make that leap without realizing that the very same thing could be said about the overall model of distributing power that they themselves support.
Yeah, it's just it's saying, let's forget about reforming the war on drugs, ending the war on drugs on a federal level and passing federal provisions preventing, authorizing, ending the prohibition of marijuana and just saying, let's let the states decide. And so maybe in, the Pacific Northwest, you'll have some very progressive policies. And then in the Deep South, you're going to see, a reversion to some of the most dark times in American history. And that's just a fact. That's why so many neo-Confederates support this agenda and why the phrase states' rights comes from the neo-Confederate movement, which substantially...
But look, you could just as easily go back in American history and point to terrible federal legislation that imposed atrocious things on states, right? There's a history of terrible things being done at both levels because at some point you have to pick a system.
That was before the Civil Rights Act. That was before full enfranchisement. And the legacy of the federal government.
One set of issues, right?
The legacy of the federal government in terms of civil liberties is, it's terrible. But you also have to look at the positive legacy, which is imposing civil rights on the South, which is where this resentment really stems.
And you have to look at the positive legacy, and you have to look at the positive legacy of states' rights as well, like spreading gay marriage and equal rights for gays, right?
I said,
it's not enough to look back to the civil. It's not enough to look back to the civil rights.
You're going to see resolutions passed in the states if you leave the issue of traditional of same-sex marriage up to the states. You're going to see resolutions that border laws that have been passed in Uganda. Based on my examination of the Christian right and what it's tried to do in the states and where it has power. And what happened in Cobb County in '96 is very instructive, should be very instructive. The issue of affirmative action is important. I don't know if you support affirmative action, but, Colorado ended affirmative action, and the University of Colorado has the lowest minority student percentage, I think, in the country. I went to do a talk on campus there, and it was, the most lily-white campus I've ever seen, and it's a very diverse state. California ended affirmative action for some time, minorities were basically the colleges were basically clear of minorities, and so these are policies that the federal government has to be regulating, and it's just a question of whether we're going to empower bullies or not. And in the end, it doesn't, in my view,
it's not a question of whether we're going to empower bullies or not. There were states that were passing gay marriage laws when the federal government was, it's still under the Defense of Marriage Act, right? Sometimes there are federal bullies, and it's people at the state level who are fighting against the bullies. It doesn't always work in one direction.
Yeah, it works in two directions. You'll see progressive resolutions passed in progressive states, and you'll see extremely reactionary, in my opinion. A lot of people would love this to happen. Extremely reactionary resolutions passed in other states, which are just massively destructive to minorities.
It seems hard to deny from your perspective that on an issue like gay marriage, state ability to control marriage and to grant gay marriages in a few states had a tremendous impact on hastening the acceptance at the federal level, and that if it weren't for those early states acting in the ways that they did, first of all, you wouldn't have had, very directly, you wouldn't have had all the people be able to fly to those states and get married. But you also wouldn't have had the movement spread if it were only able to be done at the federal level. It seems like a clear case where both the progressive and the libertarian cause were advanced by having state autonomy.
Yeah, I don't think you can point to one issue or another and say that states' rights is inherently progressive when it was really Massachusetts and California that did it, and you have the rest.
Right, states' rights isn't inherently progressive. Neither is federal system.
You have Alabama refusing to get rid of segregationist language in its constitution because they fear raising taxes. This is something that the federal government has to limit, and you're going to see. I don't know what the long-term agenda that you're getting at is, but when you talk about states' rights, it's really basically reviving it's in the way I read it, the way it sounds to me is reviving the lost cause and allowing all of these reactionary policies, which specifically target minorities, to return. And it's really up to the federal government to limit that. And it goes straight back to Lincoln. And I've had people tell me at states' rights rallies in Alabama, this goes back to Lincoln in 1860. And that's what this is about. That's why we're out here at the State House, rallying for nullification.
I would counsel you against letting those people define the.
I'm not saying that they define that. I'm letting them define libertarianism, but this is the echo of states' rights.
Right, I counsel you against letting them define.
I see libertarianism. Libertarianism to me is just it's mainly an economic movement that's about limiting regulations on the very wealthy. I don't see much else to it. And that people who are attracted to it.
I mean, if you read libertarian magazines, or if you are familiar with the work of libertarian think tanks, they certainly do a lot of stuff on the drug war. They certainly do a lot of stuff on unfair policing that targets minorities. They do a lot of stuff on conditions in prisons. They do stuff helping small minority entrepreneurs.
Cato? Because
like Cato, like Radley Balco's stuff at the Huffington Post, like a lot of the stuff that Reason writes, like its criminal justice issue. There's like the Institute for Justice and its work. There are all kinds of.
I mean, because you have all these Cato executives like Roger Pilon, who supported Bush's attacks on civil liberties. I mean, he supported FBI wiretapping. You got guys like.
Wait, hold on. How is that a response to the libertarian movement is working?
Well, I think Cato devotes some energy to civil liberties issues, but then their policy report in 2011 attacked progressive critics of the war on terror. So, I mean, they're also pushing a right-wing agenda too, and they're increasingly controlled. I mean, Cato, which is really the face of libertarianism, is increasingly controlled by the Koch brothers, who are just, extraction industry tycoons whose ultimate goal is to release them from any regulations. I mean, they've been fined in the past millions for dumping, and they would love to get rid of these regulations which limit dumping. And I mean, you look at what the Cato Institute is really doing and where they're putting their energy. Some of the energy is going into fighting the drug war and, some anti-war papers. And, I know anti-war organizers in Washington who found them in the past to be a good coalition partner. But then they have John Yoo, the guy who said, he would support the crushing of a child's testicle. The intellectual author of Bush's torture policy was on the Cato editorial board. So it's very mixed bag.
Are you sure about that?
When they wrote the Cato Supreme Court
John Yoo on the Cato editorial board?
During the Bush presidency, John Yoo was there. And he's contributed. He contributed articles prior to that on attacking Bill Clinton.
John Yoo.
I mean, I can go on about Cato.
It is true. Wait, hold on. It's true that John Yoo. I've seen a John Yoo panel. I've seen a Cato panel where John Yoo was talking during the Clinton administration about Clinton's abuses of executive power, and that's absolutely true. The fact that John Yoo was a terrible hack who completely changed all of his opinions during the Bush administration doesn't reflect poorly on Cato for having him prior to that complaining about executive power. In any case, I mean, we shouldn't turn this into a long disquisition about the Cato Institute. We have, I think, pretty different views of it. I would just say that
I'll tweet out the citation.
Your initial statement about libertarians not caring about these things isn't accurate, and it isn't a sufficient response to say, oh, well, they care about these things, but also are associated with these people that I find abhorrent, right? It's a different conversation whether those people are abhorrent and whether you disagree with them, but they do care about these things. And it's not just at Cato. Libertarians do care a lot about these issues, and I think that progressives, when they slur all libertarians as people that I can't talk to or work with, miss a big opportunity to work with them on these issues that are of mutual importance.
If I see I'm not discounting the possibility of working with libertarians, although I think, a clear line has to be drawn on working with people like Thomas Woods, who are basically white nationalists or who have cozied up to white nationalist groups, but and who have clearly influenced a lot of the thinking behind, or some of the thinking behind Gary Johnson's campaign. I'm not calling Gary Johnson a racist, but these issues do have serious implications for minorities. So, but if there are areas to work together, I mean, I'm as indignant as you are, or as you implied that you were in your Atlantic piece about Obama's secret drone war. So, I mean,
I guess I would just say that, I mean, I guess we're going pretty long, so we should end soon. But I would say, for third-party protest votes in general, I think it's a really dangerous game to sort of make your judgments about these things by saying, well, this candidate has this one advisor who's associated with.
No,
this
I'm talking
other
about ideas. I'm talking
I
about the
find
idea of nullification.
really reprehensible, right? I just think that one of the features of third parties, right, is that they're on the margins. The Libertarian Party is on the margins, the Green Party is on the margins, the Constitution, they're all on the margins. And the Justice Party, I guarantee you that if you delve into any of these groups, you'll find someone unsavory or someone with a connection to unsavory things. I don't think that Gary Johnson or Jill Stein or, I'm sorry, what's the gentleman that you support? Rocky Anderson. I don't think any of these people themselves are creepy or dangerous or fringy in a way that should terrify anyone. And I think that, I think that the guilt by association game doesn't help anyone to clarify what their ideas actually are. I don't think that Gary Johnson would at all favor some kind of neo-Confederate movement to take away the civil liberties.
He would empower such a movement by pushing nullification laws. I mean, he endorsed the nullification movement, and this is, something that...
Did he endorse it on the subject of drugs?
I mean, you endorsed the nullification movement on the subject of drugs. I don't know if he endorsed it on the subject of drugs, but he endorsed it in general. And so you endorse the whole neo-Confederate states' rights agenda.
I'm sorry, what was that? I missed that last sentence.
I said he endorsed the entire nullification movement, and all we have to do is just read Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, where he specifically denounces interposition and nullification. And
I have a suspicion that Johnson would would be happy to associate himself with.
And Martin Luther King would probably renounce him and the whole agenda of states' rights that he died fighting. I mean, this is what the civil rights movement was allayed against, is states' rights, because it means doom for religious and racial minorities, especially in the South. And it's why it's very dangerous to support a candidate on the basis of marijuana prohibition, which we should all be against, and not examine and interrogate his agenda more closely and see what the real long-term implications of it are. And that's what my point is about Gary Johnson.
To me, to me, it doesn't make any sense to be more worried about the hypothetical and highly improbable rise of a neo-Confederate South, right? To prioritize that above the actual drug war and all of the people that it is impacting every day.
I didn't say to prioritize it. I just think, if you want to make a protest vote, do so for a candidate who doesn't support, who doesn't implicitly support, in terms of the implications of their real agenda, empowering local bullies. And there are other candidates. So, I mean, you wanted to talk about Gary Johnson.
That the implications of Johnson's agenda are empowering local bullies. And I'm happy to do this again, but we should quit now because we're at 1 hour and 10 minutes, and they usually try and keep these.
All right. Well, thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, I appreciate it too, that you came on, and yeah, let's continue the conversation. And
Yeah,
I
me
enjoyed it.
too. I'd love to talk again.